And thank you for joining me. This is Psych 92, and now we're going to talk about Chapter 6, Adolescent and Socioemotional Development. Again, I encourage anyone who has questions, just unmute and ask me, and I'm happy to stop and explain any concepts. So for socioemotional development, now we're talking about how people feel about themselves and the impact of their interactions with others. So that's the idea of self-concept and self-esteem. We introduced this in early childhood. Talk about Erikson's stage of identity versus role confusion. And there's another theory, Marcia's 4 identity statuses, that you definitely need to know as well. And we'll also look at ethnic identity development. In middle and late childhood and early childhood, we talked about gender identity development, but now it's at this stage, a lot has to do with ethnic identity development. And look at the changing relationship between parents and their teens, how peers are improving and are increasing their importance, and also dating relationships. What's really fascinating about this stage is that we often attribute being emotional to adolescence. And it's important to know that when we talk about emotions, there are 3 aspects to it. There's the physiological, cognitive, and affective. So physiological means that our body is actually reacting a certain way. So it could be that our heart starts racing, or we start sweating, or our eyes dilate. All of these things are physiological components to emotion. There is the cognitive component where you're labeling what's going on. So when your body experiences a change, your brain is trying to understand what it means. That's the cognitive component. And then the affective component is kind of your decision of, oh, my heart is racing because I'm excited. That kind of idea. So then, okay, I'm feeling excited, or I'm feeling scared, or I'm feeling nervous. All of these emotions have these different components, and a lot has to do with how our brain is labeling these components. When we talk about a lot of regulation, it changes from early adolescence to late adolescence. And I wanted to talk about something because of this picture. So we see this picture with different expressions. What we found is there are developmental differences in how facial expressions are interpreted, which actually accounts for a lot of the problems that teens and their parents may have. So what we found is that parents are not great at interpreting their teens' facial expressions. So where a teen might feel like they're being neutral, a parent might think that they're angry or upset or apathetic. And so that can lead to a lot of misunderstanding. On the other hand, teens are not great at interpreting parents' tones and facial expressions also. So whereas a parent thinks that they're expressing worry, a teen may interpret that as anger. And so this misinterpretation of facial clues and voice cues actually leads to a lot of the problems that, are stereotypical of happening between teens and their adult parents. So in terms of being able to regulate emotions, this does have to do with biological processes. Hormones have a lot to do with it. The frontal lobe not being fully developed also impacts how well teens can regulate or not regulate emotions. So you can see in this chart here that in early adolescence, that's when the hormones really start, like they're just starting to really affect people. And so they could be a lot more emotional at this stage. And that whole idea of sensation seeking, they start to feel that reward from getting praise from their friends for doing risky things. In middle adolescence, it's that the height of that hormonal instability and vulnerability. And then by late adolescence, because the frontal lobe has started to develop already, then there's a lot less variability in terms of how people are acting, and much better in making decisions. So that's good news. So as I mentioned, the emotions are getting less intense, much more able to regulate emotions. And also because people start to treat, people who are 18, 17 like adults, that those social expectations also have an impact in terms of how they are regulating their emotions. Sadly, decrease the average happiness decreases at this stage. So you can see from fifth grade, self-reported happiness is pretty high, and it just like keeps dropping all the way through high school. So a lot of times it's that emotional intensity. It starts to, the emotional regulation starts to increase, and then people are not letting themselves be more emotional and express happiness. It's almost seen as being immature if you show too much exuberation. So that becomes part of it. In terms of self-concept, because of abstract reasoning, now, you start to think about the future. Oh, are you going to go to college? What do you want to do for a living? All these kind of ideas start to come in adolescence. Self-understanding can be really challenging, a lot filled with contradictions, right? So it becomes a worrisome time. People who engage in introspection might feel like they're being hypocritical. They might be concerned. They are very concerned about what their friends and family um, think about them. And so because of all of this, their self-esteem is really impacted as well. So in terms of Erikson's psychosocial stages, we are here in stage 5, identity versus role confusion. So remember, at first you start off with, is the world a safe place? That's stage 1. Stage 2, the world is a safe place. I'm going to try things on my own, and that's the autonomy component. Stage 3 is that initiative of wanting to do things and building that confidence as they get to do things. Stage 4 is feeling accomplished, setting goals and accomplishing them. That makes them feel industrious. Now you're starting to compare yourselves with others. If you feel like others are doing more than you are, then you're going to feel inferiority. And so from that, now we're going to learn more about ourselves. And that's the whole identity, the idea of identity versus role confusion. So Erikson had posed this as, who am I and what do I want to make of myself? So this is why the possibilities are endless in many ways. This is when people think about their capabilities, who are they as people, and what kind of adult do they want to be ultimately. So these choices are impacted by people's values. This is the age of experimentation. Think about what works for them. And a lot of their self-confidence is very much tied into their sense of identity. So this idea of what do I want to make of myself and what do I have to work with speaks to agency, right? This is talking about people actively constructing who they are and what they want to be as an adult. It also thinks about, reality. So part of formal operations is knowing, having a better sense of who they are, what limitations there are. For instance, maybe in early childhood, someone wants to be a doctor, but then they're terrified of blood. So that's a reality that they need to consider. And it does speak to how, at this stage especially, it's important to consider not only how you perceive yourself, but that what other people think of you is also important. In terms of identity, it has a lot of different dimensions. There's the physical aspect, meaning your age, your sex, ability status, your racial or ethnic appearance, all of that plays into your identity. There is the historical component, meaning, what has happened in your past? What are your ancestors like? What's your family history, your religion, your culture, those components. There's a selective aspect as well. These are things that you choose, like your hobbies, maybe, extracurricular activities you want to do, maybe your political affiliation. Those are all selective components. So identity has to do with everything, how you sense yourself, right? So goals, past, beliefs, abilities, and values. That all plays into one's identity. In terms of aspects of identity, there are 2 main components. There's a personal component, which is how you evaluate yourself, your own attributes. In the personal component, we're not talking about you being in a room with other people. This is the part about you seeing yourself in the mirror kind of idea. It's separate, it's distinct, it's constant. It's the part of you that nobody else knows, and it's very stable. On the other hand, there's a social aspect of identity. And these are the social definitions of who you are, and it has to do with the groups that you belong to. And we'll talk about what we mean by groups you belong to. Social identity is very much tied to comparisons you make about yourself and other people in the room. And because it has to do with that relativity, it's very fluid. So the personal component is stable. The social component is fluid. So think about it. How you feel when you're in a classroom is probably, and how you behave and how things you say are going to be different than how you are with your family. So there's an element of you that's consistent in both contexts, but there's also an aspect of you that changes based on who you're with in the room, and that's the social component. So a very important theory in terms of this identity is social identity theory. And this was in 1978 and 1979. And in social identity theory, what they're saying is that how somebody thinks about themselves as a person, it is actually being defined from groups that that person belongs to. So when we talk about an in-group, that is anybody who belongs to groups where you say things like we or us. Out-group is anybody who you would identify as a them or they. So, right, makes sense. In-group is inclusive, out-group is exclusive. And we are constantly making decisions about who is in our in-group and who is in our out-group. And these decisions, we call it social cognition. 3 steps to social cognition. First step is categorization. So when you walk into a room, you're immediately looking at who's there and you become aware that differences exist. It's automatic. We are looking at actually age, race, ethnicity, and gender. Those are the 3 categories that we are automatically assessing as soon as we walk into a room. Oftentimes, it could be based on physical attributes. You might be looking at people's skin color or their eyes or their nose shape or clothes that they're wearing. Those are things that we're looking at. So that's what it could also be cultural characteristics, maybe the way people are speaking. Do they have an accent? All of these things make us aware that there are differences between us and anybody in the room. Second stage is identification. So that is seeing this group of people and feeling if you have any affiliation, group membership with anyone in the room, right? And social identity theory says that we actually become most conscious when we are in a minority group. So even if we have a lot in common with other people, we actually hone in on the component that makes us minority. And we believe that that is, it's actually an evolutionary adaptation. Because if you're in a minority, you are in a more dangerous situation. So it's important for people to be aware of that. And then the final component is that realization of your group status. You're comparing. So if I am part of the female group, are we in a position of dominance or position of weakness? Again, that goes back to kind of evolutionary reasons for being aware when you're in a position of weakness. So what's nice is that we belong to multiple groups. So instead of just focusing on race, ethnicity, gender, age, that is our fast thinking. That is kind of the intuitive thought. What we want to do is think analytically and realize that we belong to a lot of groups. So we're not limited to these initial categories of race, ethnicity, gender, age. We can think of many different categories, and I encourage people to actually think about the categories that are more inclusive, because that helps our mindset. If we feel like we are being threatened or in danger, we actually can't learn in these situations. We have to feel safe and included in order to learn well in any situation. Any questions about social cognition? Okay, so another theory has to do with identity development. So Finney talked about 2 dimensions of identity development. That's exploration and commitment. So exploration is looking at your possibilities. Commitment is how much are you willing to adopt it to be part of your life. And these dimensions were part of how Marcia talked about his identity status model. So either you have explored, no or yes, and have you committed, no or yes. If you have not explored your identity and not committed, we call that being part of identity diffusion. So you could see that matrix. If you have not explored, but you are committed, we call that being foreclosed. And I'll talk about each one. If you have explored but not committed, we call that moratorium. And if you have explored and committed, then we call that being achieved. So those are the 4 ideas: diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. So diffusion is adolescent doesn't know or care what their identity is. That's also called role confusion. They're not really thinking about it, just kind of going with the flow. That's diffusion. With foreclosure, that's also known as premature identity formation. The adolescents are simply accepting whatever it is the role models say they are. So in this picture, the girl is dressed exactly like her mom, so she is accepting that without questioning. That's foreclosure. With moratorium, it's you're exploring, but you're not yet committing. And this is socially acceptable. So college is a great example of a time when you're encouraged to explore and not yet commit. We want you to try these different GE classes and see what is really speaking to you. That's kind of the idea with college. And so we don't want you to commit right away. And then achievement is when you've had the time to explore and you're finally committed. And usually there's a really good sense when you have that identity achievement because you feel comfortable in your skin, right? This is a graph, a table of different characteristics and whether in this society there is more power or less power. I don't have a ton of time, so I'm not going to focus on this, but you could see that these are different categories: age, disability, religion, ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous background, national origin, and gender. And then it indicates where in the US, whether you are in a group with more power or less power. Remember, based on social identity theory, you become most aware of the group that is in less power. Whatever group you identify with that has less power, you become hyper aware of that based on social identity theory. Ethnic identity. So in early childhood and late childhood, gender identity becomes more, happens earlier. And then ethnic identity tends to form later. So with ethnic identity, it's people coming to terms with who they are based on their racial or ethnic ancestry. You think about the positives and negatives of the groups, and it really depends, again, based on where that your culture is in that graph that we talked about, whether less power or more power. If you are in a group that has higher status, you don't think about ethnic identity as much as those who are in lower status groups. So in terms of ethnic differences, people with Northern European backgrounds may not really engage in ethnic identity pursuit. Anybody who is racially or culturally distinct, then there is self-identification, and there's at least part of it is imposed, where people will be like, where are you from? You know, or what are you? I hate that question, but people ask that all the time. And that question is being triggered because there is some sort of obviously physically distinct characteristic that you have. And so when you have hyphenations, when people say Asian American, Latin American, it's usually a recognition of these distinctions. So Marcia talked about the identity statuses. Finney also had an idea of how ethnic identity developed. So in hers, there's the unexamined ethnic identity when people don't really think about it. There's this search exploration stage of ethnic identity. So you can think about that as like moratorium if we're matching it to Marcia. And usually it's a triggering event. Somebody will say something or do something that makes you realize, oh, I'm ethnically distinct from these people, right? Ethnic internalization is understanding that you are this certain ethnic group and there's nothing that's going to change that. And then the last part is achieved when people have explored and searched and committed to their ethnic identity. So as Marcia said that there were 4 stages, Finney says there are 3. This is kind of the patterns of how identity develops. And gender identity tends to occur earlier, about 2.5 years old, whereas ethnic identity is 3 to 4 years old. If people are in mixed heritage households, ethnic awareness is much earlier. So in terms of ethnic identity, about 6 to 8 years old, they consistently identify with certain ethnic group and understand the idea of ethnic constancy, meaning changing your clothes is not going to change your ethnic or racial group. And then 8 to 10, they develop ethnic attitudes. This is going to be based on experiences they have and socialization of their family, whether positive or negative. In adolescence, they might start to think about labels to use. Am I Latina, Latine? Am I Chicano? Those kind of things. This starts to make those decisions in adolescence. Okay, shifting on to relationships. A big one, of course, parents and adolescents. And we know that conflicts happen, but research has showed that the fights are not about major issues. They tend to be territorial, boundary disputes. Why are you going into my room without asking me? Why are you asking me about my friends? Those kind of things. So these are boundary disputes. They're not really big issues. They're smaller issues, but they feel very real to the adolescents. So what are parents supposed to do? Well, they should support autonomy because we're preparing children, these adolescents, to become adults, right? But we still have to monitor them because we know their prefrontal cortex is not fully formed and they still need guidance, a lot of guidance. So what we notice is that when people become too strict, it's a dead end. It's just going to lead to fights. So what parents should do is provide clear standards, enforce the rules as much as people might not like it. It's not a good idea to try to be someone's best friend at this stage. Rules and standards are really important to set that expectation for adolescents. It's important to explain decisions, not just my way or the highway, but explain why decisions are being made. Important also to monitor whereabouts, again, because you don't know who they're with. You want to make sure they're safe, and also be flexible and warm. So this is the authoritative type of parenting is the most effective in terms of dealing with adolescents. Social relationships, what we see is that in adolescence, people spend less time with their parents, much more time with their peers, but parents still play an important role in their lives and also influence the peer interactions, especially if they're not driving, right? So the parents will tend to be the ones to take them to events with their peers. So how parents handle situations is very much going to impact the relationship with their adolescents. In terms of friends, really there are three components: reciprocity, intimacy, and autonomy. So reciprocity is becoming friends with people who want to be friends with you as well. Intimacy is how much you're willing to share about yourselves and your private thoughts and feelings. And then autonomy is, being independent from your friends. What's different for boys and girls, we know, is that boys tend to have activity-based friendships. They don't just sit and talk with each other. They tend to talk and share things in the process of engaging in activity, whereas girls tend to they'll get together just to talk. So that's the big difference. Homophily is the term that we talk about in terms of birds of a feather flock together. So that's a tendency for people to become friends with and affiliate with those who have similarities to them. So it could be age, race, athletics, ability, hobbies, right? That's the selectivity component. And as you spend time with people, you're socializing each other. So who people decide to be their friends is really, really important, especially at this stage, because of that socialization aspect. So it's important to know who your teens' friends are. Deviancy training is what we call it when friends negatively influence the behaviors of teenagers. Any questions about these three terms? Okay, cliques and crowds, what we see, I don't think we even use these terms anymore, but it's a research-based term. What we know is that it goes from small same-sex family size groupings, right? Maybe 5 people. Then it becomes small mixed sex groupings where you have males and females, and then you have larger mixed self groupings. And then, being part of these crowds, having that sense of belonging meets both emotional and security needs. Remember that adolescence into risk taking, right? We have the personal fable and imaginary audience and the underdeveloped prefrontal cortex that leads to that poor decision making. So these are terms that you need to know. Again, homophily, we tend to associate with people who are like us. Deviant peer contagion is when peers reinforce problematic behavior. Cliques are groups of individuals who interact frequently, and crowds are larger groupings that usually they're together more for reputations or activity rather than interactions. These are some things that we know happen in adolescence. Depression, internalizing is when you take all your problems and just take it in, and that could lead to depression, guilt, and anxiety. Externalizing behavior could lead to aggression, drug use, and delinquent behavior. So that's the part that's negative. So internalizing, remember, unfortunately, happiness goes down. And in adolescence, we see that happiness really goes down much more for females than for males. That's what this chart is showing. And then externalizing, what we see is that if somebody in early childhood already has a difficult temperament and the caregivers don't have good parenting skills, that can lead to the kids being under-socialized, having aggressive interactions with their peers. And by middle childhood, those kids could be rejected by their peers and probably have poor academic outcomes. And then what happens is that they become committed to a deviant peer group and then leads to delinquency. So those are the problematic kind of sequence that happens. In terms of romantic relationships, becomes really important in adolescence, often becomes really intense. The acceptability of being in relationships really depends on culture. And what dating does serve a purpose, right? This is kind of training ground for when people are older. So it's important, a great way to have fun, have companionship. And oftentimes, people who are in relationships as adolescents, they have a higher status than their single peers. And of course, it leads to sexual exploration and gives people kind of training ground for mate selection. Dating stages starts from mixed sex peer groups, right? This is heterosexual dating process. Middle adolescence, usually it's brief or casual dating, then group dating. Late adolescence, that's when people start to get into more exclusive, intensive relationships. And when they are in these intensive relationships, people don't have time to get into further friendships as much. Here's some risk factors for teen pregnancy. I'm not going to go over it. You can read that, but the factors that decrease the risk of teen pregnancy: close parent-child relationship. That's really important to know. Having parental supervision, again, is really important. And knowing that parents what are the parental values in terms of teen intercourse? Do they support it? Do they think it's not a good idea? Hopefully they're encouraging having protection if they do engage in intercourse. And having a high self-esteem is also a really important protective factor in terms of preventing teen pregnancy. So here is kind of a summary of what we talked about in terms of social and emotional development in adolescence, right? We start to improve in emotional regulation, how people see themselves and judge themselves. Self-concept and self-esteem is very different than in early childhood. We do have contradictions in self-understanding. In terms of Erikson's framework, we're in the 5th stage, identity versus role confusion. So we talked about the components of personal and social identity, social cognition, the different identity statuses, the stages of ethnic identity development according to Finney. And we talked about kind of relationships and how those changes as well. So thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I will post this